Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Welcome to NCTE. This is the first hour, this is the first session, right? All right. Oh, we already got applause. This is great. So this is Indigenizing English Education, foregrounding Native American voices, texts, histories, and communities in secondary English classrooms. My name is Robert Patron. I'm a professor at the University of Missouri. And I am so honored and thrilled to be a part of this session. These are some of my absolute favorite people in English education today, doing amazing work, and I'm just thrilled to be here with you all to share some of that. Just a quick note, this is a photograph by Adam Sings in the Timber. He's an Apsolake photographer, and part of his work is really trying to decolonize colonizing spaces through his photography. And this is a photo that he took last week, or 2 weeks ago rather, at the University of Missouri. And these are the two executive members of the Four Directions Native American student group on campus at Mizzou. And they're holding signs that say, Native American history is American history. And we're thrilled that we have one of the models with us here today, and she's standing right next to me, Melissa Horner. So we're gonna actually start the presentation, the panel, with a land acknowledgement. And I'm gonna pull it up here so you all can see it. So we'd like to offer an acknowledgement of the indigenous peoples who practiced and continue to practice culture, ceremony, and life on this sacred ecology of lands and waters we convene on today in what is colonially known as Baltimore.
Specifically, we would like to acknowledge the Piscataway peoples, as well as the past and present peoples of the Cedarville Band of Piscataway-Conway, the Piscataway Indian Nation, and the Piscataway-Conway tribe, all of whom were and are impacted by removals, reservations, and colonial borders.
In acknowledging these peoples and these ancestrally connected homelands and waters, it is important to recognize that our ability to have and attend an NCTE conference at all is due to colonial practices and the practices of genocide and cultural erasure.
In making this acknowledgement, we hope to create a space, if even for a few moments, to disrupt colonizing practices and continue making visible Native peoples and places, historically and contemporarily, as part of our work toward tribal sovereignty, equity, and social transformation. Yes. Sorry, it's a little short. In the spirit of acknowledging the peoples indigenous to this land, it's also important to acknowledge contemporary contributions of Native people. So for instance, here in Baltimore, there's the American Indian Center that currently supports Native cultures, histories, and families living in Baltimore. And there's also an app called The Guide to Indigenous DC. It's an app developed by some folks at George Washington University. You can download it on your phone, and everything in the DC area is from an Indigenous perspective of what the land and places here, what's been going on here currently.
We also just wanted to highlight a few other sessions that are happening at NCTE that are cohering around some similar issues that this panel will discuss. And so I can put this up at the end as well, if you want to take a photo of it real quick. I'll just highlight that Tommy Orange is here, author of There. And he'll be speaking on Saturday morning at 9:30. And then these are only three. This is the first year that I've seen a decent sized number of sessions around these issues. So I'm really thrilled about that and excited to be part of that. We have 5 people who will be speaking once I sit down. Melissa Horner is the first one. She's coming from the University of Missouri, where she's a sociology PhD student. She'll be talking about curriculum she developed and taught as a high school English teacher in Montana. Then we have Nicholas Rink. He's a teacher at Buffalo High Academy on the Blackfeet Reservation in Montana, Browning, Montana, doing amazing work. He's going to talk to us about a curriculum he developed on res dogs as a pathway to talk about sovereignty. Then we have Avi Penhallow. He flew in yesterday from Hawaii, and he's going to be talking to us about stories and storytelling and in his classroom, his teaching. Then we have Dr. Joaquin Mudens, and he's going to be talking to us about young adult literature that focuses on Native youth and issues in teacher education program. And then we're so thrilled that we have Dr. Tim Sampedro from The Ohio State University, one of the leading scholars in English education on Native issues, as our discussant today. So we're thrilled you're here. Thank you so much. And I'm going to turn it over to Melissa.
Tanchi, Kakiao, Mizami, Boju, Ajayayan, Mikinok, Doji. My name is Melissa. How is everyone this morning? I am of Turtle Mountain, which is in North Dakota, but I was born and raised in Montana. And I'm opening with part of this as kind of a spirit of transparency of letting you all know who I am, particularly in relation to my teaching context. So this photo here is my grandmother. My grandmother is First Nations Cree and Turtle Mountain Chippewa is what the federal government calls us. We call ourselves Métis. And that leads me into my teaching context. So I was a biracial Native teacher teaching in a completely white rural context in Montana. So that's kind of was my entry point to teaching about Indigenous peoples and issues in Montana. Montana has a Native population of 7% of the total population, so it's one of the largest populations of Native folks per capita. But my specific teaching context was completely white. It was about a 40-minute drive from the nearest Native reservation, but my students didn't know what that reservation even was, who the people were, what the tribal nation was, how it had been created. So I just share that as a way to kind of orient you all to the context again that I was in. So what I'm going to talk a little bit about today is just one slice of a 10th grade curriculum that I developed and taught. So the year-long curriculum was a focus on genocide. So I opened with Elie Wiesel's Night and the Holocaust, and I segued into, from the Holocaust into the genocide of Native people historically and as it continues to happen contemporarily. And then from that, I segued into a genocide happening on the African continent through this book, What is the What? It's written by Dave Eggers and Valentina Achek-Deng, South Sudanese gentleman. And then from that, I segued into the To Kill a Mockingbird, but I taught it from an anti-racist point of view and thinking about genocide via fear, imprisonment, incarceration, murder of African American folks in the United States today. And so one of the things that I always kind of grounded this curriculum in was literacy researcher Paulo Freire's idea of reading the word in the world. So in this specific curriculum that I'm going to share a little bit more about in a couple of minutes, I really wanted to focus on how were we reading text in the classroom that helped us read the world outside of the classroom and continue to move fluidly from classroom space text to world text, and how we could use both of those spaces to understand each a little bit better. So the primary components of this unit was a novel called Wind from an Enemy Sky, written by Darcy McNichol. He is he's Cree and Métis, but he was adopted by the Confederated Salish Kootenai tribes in Montana. I also used the Dakota Access Pipeline Nonviolent Direct Action movement. I taught this unit in real time as that was going on. I also used a bunch of other supplementary texts throughout. So media representations of Native folks. I used poetry by Native Montanan authors, music, again, by contemporary Native folks. And then some of the key understandings in this unit were Native American ideologies, traditions, and beliefs that are current, that go on today, that aren't a historical thing, although they are rooted in history. Reservations and land use, and then notions of tribal sovereignty. So the novel I taught is considered historical fiction. And so it's about a tribal nation called the Little Elk, and its history and how it's presented in the book was mirrored after the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes on the Flathead Reservation in Montana. The book takes place in about the mid-1930s, which for a lot of Native communities, particularly the ones in Montana, was a really heavy transition period from more traditional ways of being and living to much more colonial ways of living at that point in time. The primary kind of conflict or tension in the book is the building of a dam. So this is historically fits in kind of the New Deal era with all of the things that were going on historically at that point in time. So the book is about a dam that was being built on native lands, and in real life that dam really exists. It used to be called the Kerr Dam, and now it's called the Salis Kasunta Kelly's Bay Dam. And just kind of a quick note, the tribal nation actually recently took over ownership of that dam just a few years ago. So the nation now owns it, but of course when the book was being written, they didn't have ownership of it at that time. And so the second slice I took was the water protector movement at Standing Rock. And so I traveled there in support of the movement multiple times myself during the teaching of this unit. And I knew I wanted to teach this text, Wind from an Enemy Sky, and I saw so many parallels of what was going on in the book and what was going on at Standing Rock. Everything from just really kind of ignorance in mainstream media about issues that Native communities face and treaty breaches and unceded land, all the way to movements that Native peoples have been behind and driving for a very long time, although this is one that got, a lot of media attention eventually. So one of the things that was really important for my students was to contextualize and historicize Standing Rock. And it was much easier to do that with the help of the book because they were learning history about a dam being created on a piece of land and a pipeline going in another piece of land where a lot of the issues were the same. So we could use one to understand the other much, much better and much more deeply and thoroughly than anything they would have ever been able to get on the news, for instance, or even on some blogs or online sources. And so, again, I already said a few of these things, but what ended up being really valuable about this unit was that the students were able to really see how Native communities' connection to land in really concrete ways. So instead of just saying, Native people have connection to land and having that be romanticized or just not understood very well, they were seeing very particular examples in the book of the pain that the tribal nation was going through having a dam come in and kill the water that was their life source. And then again, reading about Native people's experiences at Standing Rock and seeing footage from that going on and being able to really, at least better understand why it was such a big deal that land was being torn up to put something inside of it that was from a non-Native agenda. And then this is just another sort of, I mentioned I used other supplemental activities, so I just wanted to mention this one because it was quite related. So one of the activities we did was media representations of Natives, and I'm going to talk particularly about the one on the left. So this was an assignment that a young girl had to dress like an Indian. And so her family, and again, this was in 2016, so her family responded to this assignment by dressing her up as a water protector. So it was their way of being like, okay, dress up like an Indian, we're not gonna put feathers and all these other stereotypical offensive things on you. What are Native people doing today, like right now? So that was just kind of an example. We read that article in class, we jigsawed it with another article about mascots, and then we would talk about those kinds of things. So that's just for example. And then the culminating project for this unit was to, the students basically developed kind of an in-class and in-school textbook called Tribal Nations of Today and Tomorrow. So one of the other activities we did early on in the unit was analyze social studies textbooks for what was being said, what stories were being told about Native people and communities, and they found all kinds of kind of gross flaws in those books. So one of the things this assignment did is to draw on everything we had talked about over the course of this unit and be able to develop textbook entries that were a little bit more representative of some truths that were going on historically and contemporarily, and particularly how we start to understand those, bridge those understandings of what happened in the past absolutely makes sense for what's happening today and vice versa. So one last, I'm actually gonna skip this, we only have 2 minutes left. So some of the primary student takeaways for this unit was the idea, again, kind of looking at history and how it affects present day, where students were like, oh, I understand now why the Standing Rock Lakota don't want a pipeline in, because that land that it's going in on was actually, it's still theirs. So, you know, learning really concrete things like that really helps students to understand history and then how they can better understand present day. And then another really important takeaway for students during this was that the contemporary awarenesses of what Native individuals, Native communities, tribal nations are doing today, that it's not just a historical thing that was going on. These are not people that are extinct. These are people who are musicians and teachers and scholars and authors. And so really infusing the curriculum with that awareness, the students walked away with those awarenesses. All right, that is all I have.